Broadly, there are three different ways that video game teams get stuck. They can get stuck always starting, they can get stuck always finishing, and they can get stuck always making. A team that is stuck always starting is building prototypes, they're experimenting, they're trying a lot of different roads in order to try to figure out the game they want to make, in order to try to figure out the right version of the features they want to make. But they never are able to be satisfied with what they have. And they're always looking for new things, better things, trying new engines, trying new art directions, trying new variations of the features that are going to be in their game. Eventually, such a team needs to simply pick a direction. They need to pick a version of the game they're going to make and make it. They need to pick one of their prototypes and decide that that is the direction that they're going to take. What you see in the indie space sometimes is teams that build prototypes and then very quickly take that prototype and turn it into a shipped game. So if you have a team that loves the process of starting, that loves that early experimentation, in the indie space, it can be a viable strategy to embrace that, as long as you're willing to do the extra little bit of work to get things ready to ship. Now, often those games are going to be only half or three-quarters baked. They may contain bugs, they may be missing bits around the edges, but they can still be interesting, they can still find an audience. In AAA, that's a lot harder. If you make a game out of a collection of prototypes in the AAA space, that's going to be a game that's going to probably get a lot of criticism. But in the indie space, it can be a viable strategy. Typically, a team that is stuck starting is missing the ability to make decisions, missing the ability to stick to decisions that is already made. So they may not have a strong leader, they may have a dysfunctional leadership team that is second-guessing itself. Sometimes this also occurs because teams get bored with things. They've made a prototype of a conversation system, and now it's 6 months later, and they've gotten bored of that conversation system as they've been exploring other prototypes, and they want to set it aside and do something else. What a team that gets stuck starting needs is momentum. Starting can be really exciting because typically you're making a lot of forward progress, things look really great, things are getting better really fast, and then once you start to feel the resistance of a feature actually reaching beyond a prototype, sometimes some people want to then set it aside and pick up a different prototype. Because again, they get obsessed with that speed that can occur in the early stages of a project. Now, of course, this feeling of speed is illusionary, isn't it? If you spend all of your time trying 100 different prototypes and never picking one that's going to actually ship with your game, how much forward progress are you actually making? Are you actually moving towards the completion of your game, or are you just spinning your wheels, just spinning in a circle, trying prototype after prototype and never actually making any forward progress? Unreal as an engine can be a real danger for teams that love starting, because it's very good at prototyping. It's very good at making a lot of very fast, early progress in a game, in a feature, in an experiment. And then once you start trying to enter into production, then the resistance starts to come into place. And then teams are more likely to feel the pressure to move somewhere else where the friction isn't as high. Let's use the analogy of a company that makes tables. If you are stuck starting, then rather than making tables, you are prototyping different table arrangements. You are drawing plans. You are maybe doing a mock-up, but you're never building a final table. Maybe you're afraid to cut into that very expensive wood. Maybe you're really obsessed with finding the perfect table layout. But whatever is keeping you stuck, you're stuck in the process of thinking about what a table is going to be like rather than the process of actually building a table. Teams that get stuck making stuff are teams that get trapped in production. They either very quickly made prototypes in order to get into production, or they just made things the same as they were before. What tends to happen with a team that is stuck making, as opposed to starting or finishing, is you end up with a huge backlog of mostly done things, but nothing is ever brought to completion. So you end up with an ever-increasing backlog of content, an ever-increasing backlog of features that all theoretically fit together into a whole, but the act of bringing them into that final state is never really done. For AAA teams that get stuck in starting, you often don't even really hear about them because they never get far enough along to even get announced. But a lot of AAA teams that you hear about that get into trouble are usually having this problem of getting stuck making stuff. They have an ever-increasing amount of content, but nothing is quite getting to its final state of being ready to ship. There can be a temptation to shy away from bringing content to complete because it means you're not allowed to touch it anymore. It means you're saying it's done. It means that you're opening yourself up to criticism. You're opening yourself up to having other people critique what you've done. Whereas it can feel like if you just leave it in this perpetual state of being made, that critique can never come. But of course, you can't ship a game that's just a mostly done collection of parts. A lot of times when you hear about teams that get themselves into trouble, they're getting stuck in the act of making. They're failing to bring their content to a shippable state. And then what often has to happen is that somebody has to be brought in. The reality is that every game could be polished a little bit more, could have one less bug, could spend more time iterating on its content. But at some point you've got to ship. And at some point, you've got to start the process of deciding when things are good enough or great enough, or it's time to move on and start the process of bringing everything together. A lot of teams forget that the act of integration, the act of bringing things together, can often take just as long as the act of making the content in the first place. So if you get stuck in the act of making, you're building yourself a lot of debt that you're going to have to pay in the future when you finally start the process of shipping your game. If you've never brought any content in your game to a shippable state, then you don't really know how expensive it is to do that. And the act of avoiding that often is actually making that process even more expensive. Again, this is often a lack of leadership. This is a lack of somebody within the team being willing to say, this is good enough, it's time to move on. On larger teams, it can be very easy for this to happen because there are lots of different departments, lots of dependencies that can prevent a piece of content from reaching final. It might make mathematical sense to say, delay your lighting pass until everyone else is done with the content to avoid reworking. But because you've never done that final lighting pass on any of your content, you don't actually know how long that's going to take. You don't know what impact that's going to have on performance. At some point, you have to take some piece of content to final, to shippable, in order to understand the entire process. And what you might find in the process of doing that is that the very moody lighting that you think looks best for your game actually means you can save some time in other places because you can't actually see all of the intricate textures on the books on the bookshelf. One reason why teams get stuck in the act of making is this micro level efficiency. Because you can focus down on very atomic level tasks, you can check a lot of things off your to-do list. The problem comes when you never take the time to bring those parts together. That efficiency, like over prototyping, becomes an illusion. You build this giant warehouse of stuff, but because you never bring it together, it never turns into anything. You might be missing half of your parts. You might have 1,000 different character models, but you never rigged them. So you don't have 1,000 characters, you just have 1,000 character models, but without their rigs, without their animation, without their audio, they're not something that can actually be put into the game. So if you're not spending the time to bring them together, you're ultimately just building up a warehouse of inventory, which ultimately doesn't make a game. You need to spend the time to bring things together, to let them bounce off each other, to let them coalesce, to make sure that you've done all the things you need to do to allow that to occur. So for a team that is stuck in the act of making it, what they really need is some piece of content that shows them what done looks like and somebody in a leadership position pushing for more and more content to reach that point. That single piece of content can serve as a seed crystal around which the rest of the game can start to crystallize. This is where demos can actually be really helpful. While demos usually contain some degree of special throwaway content, throwaway code built just for the demo, the fact that it looks done, the fact that it potentially plays like it's done, can serve as that seed crystal. Even if nothing in the demo ultimately makes it into the final game, it can still serve to cause the process of crystallization to start to happen. Going back to the table building company, if you are stuck building, then you are approaching things from this mindset. Well, we need to build a lot of tables, so rather than constantly changing up our machinery to do different things, what we're going to do is we're going to cut just table legs, and we're going to cut 1,000 table legs before we move on to the next thing. And you may never reach the point of actually having all the parts you need to even put a table together. Even if you do start building all the parts, because you've never put a final table together, gone through the finishing process, you don't know that maybe there's a mistake in your plans and there's a gap in one of the parts you've made. Maybe they don't quite fit together right. Maybe the finishing is going to be very difficult. You are collecting this backlog of components, but you're never assembling things into one final table. The final way that teams get stuck is in the act of always finishing. Now, I would argue that this is probably the most rare, where teams that are always starting are experimenting and looking for new ways to do things. And teams that are always building are amassing an ever-growing backlog of content and features, but never bringing them into a whole. A team that's always finishing is never really getting a lot of lift because they're always landing the plane. They get off the ground and they immediately start the process of landing back on the tarmac. A team that is always finishing is worried about all the things I just talked about. They're worried about wasting work. They're worried about maybe this won't be performant. They're worried about keeping the game in a constant state of being shippable. If you take this too far, it means that you're not willing to experiment. You want to make sure you're always half a step away from being able to upload the thing to Steam. This can prevent a team from exploring the space. You can end up being overly derivative or just picking the first idea that comes to mind and going with that. And because you're always in a state of shipping and you're always in a state of finishing, it's psychologically nearly impossible for a team like this to back up and redo decisions. If they've gone down the wrong road, a team that's stuck in the state of finishing is going to have no ability to back up and choose a different path because they're shipping. I've seen teams do this. I've seen teams stuck in this mindset. Usually it's something that a team that has what appears to be a very firm date gets stuck in because they are obsessed with the fact that the game is coming out in 3 months. So they are not doing what the game needs because they're just focused so strongly on that date out in the future, and they can't take a step back and consider what maybe the game needs, even if it's going to put that date at risk. And sometimes that's what you have to do. Sometimes the date is what matters. Sometimes you only have $50 left in the bank account and you got to ship or the studio's going under. But if you spend too much time in this state of finishing, if you are stuck in a state of finishing, especially earlier in your project development, it's going to prevent you from building enough content. It's going to prevent you from potentially experimenting with better ways to do your features. You're running the risk of building a game that is too small and potentially too derivative because you're not willing to explore the space. One common way that a team can get stuck in the act of finishing is when they need to move on to something new after they've just shipped something. If that team has spent a long time and a lot of energy in the act of shipping a big game, and now they're in a different phase of the project, what can happen is the team can kind of get stuck in the mentality of we gotta ship. Even on DLC, you sometimes see this, where The team doesn't want to experiment, doesn't want to try new things because they've been in that mindset of, we've got to ship things, we've got to make compromises, we've got to do whatever it takes to get the game out. And now you need them to think in a different way. And it can be difficult for the team to set aside the tools of shipping and pick up the tools of making once again. If your table making company is stuck finishing, then what's happening is you are taking each individual piece to completion as you go. It's incredibly inefficient. You have an order for 15 tables in the backlog, but you're spending all of your time perfecting this one single table. Meanwhile, the other 14 people canceled their order. Different dev teams tend to have different personalities. They have a tendency to like different phases of project development. Some teams love the process of starting, of prototyping, of experimenting, of finding new ways to do things, of exploring a wide swath of potential games or art directions. Some teams love the smoothness that comes in production, the act of building stuff, of checking things off of a checklist, of building up that backlog of content. It feels like the engine is running at peak RPMs and you're cruising down the road as fast as the team will ever be going. And some teams love the act of finishing. They love getting things done, getting things into a state of completion. They love the process of that beautiful final crystal forming into the game that's going to ship. But even if your team has a personality that likes one of these three states, you can usually shift their thinking to be willing to enter a different phase. And that's ultimately the job of leadership, is to take a team that loves starting and get them into the process of being in production. To take that team that loves being in production and start the process of finishing, forcing them to bring things to a state of being done. To take a team that is hyper-focused on the date and give them the permission to back up and think about different ways to approach things, to build more content. And I've definitely seen cases when the same team has gotten stuck a couple of times in different states of mind, because as the reality going around the project changes, the team is going to change as well. And its personality will shift to some degree to what is going on. You as a leader need to think about how you need the team to be thinking and how they're tending to think, and shift their thought process as is needed for the project. Otherwise, you can get stuck in any of these three states, and in any of these three states, it's going to be very difficult for you to ship a game. So what do you want your table company to be doing? Well, ideally, you make a prototype, you drop a few different plans, you spend a little bit of time deciding what you want your tables to look like, then you relatively quickly, you make one table and bring it to a final state using your final processes as much as possible, figuring out the bottlenecks in your processes, figuring out where the plan had a mistake, tweaking as you go, and then getting one final table. Then you might go back to production and decide we can save a lot of time by cutting a bunch of legs all at once. But even still, you don't get stuck in that accumulation of components. You still stop once in a while and assemble the things you're building to make sure that the saw hasn't gone out of alignment, to make sure that something hasn't gone wrong along the way, to make sure that things still make sense as you go, to look for additional refinements to your processes. You take advantage of the efficiency to be gained by focusing on the making stuff part of development, but you're continuously moving components all the way to completion, bringing some of your tables to completion so that you're making sure that your processes, your pipeline, are continuously getting better. This also has the added side effect, the added advantage that you're bringing money in because you have tables to sell. If you are stuck in any of the three ways that we've talked about, then you aren't bringing money in because you either have no tables or you might have one overly polished table, and that's not enough to keep the lights on at your table making company. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you're more interested in supporting the channel in that way. Both patrons and channel members get access to our Discord, so that's a great way to interact with this community to a deeper level. Higher tier members also get early access to videos, so if you were such a member, you would have seen this video a while ago. Where have you gotten stuck before? I've definitely seen teams get stuck in all three of these places. The most common, I would say, in AAA is getting stuck in the middle, is getting stuck in the act of making and failing to bring things to completion. But definitely I've seen teams get stuck in starting, teams get stuck in the act of prototyping, and on occasion, especially for teams that have just shipped a game, getting stuck in the act of finishing. Let's talk about it down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.